here. Okay, so thank you all again for joining our session today. This is the closeout of this workshop series where the last two sessions we focused on just supporting students and campus communities in quitting tobacco and nicotine products. And last week we focused on the advocacy efforts for smoke and tobacco-free policies. And this week, we are focusing on implementation and compliance. And I would say that if you are even working on policy adoption right now, hopefully you are in this session as well, because we often get questions before policies are adopted on how do we enforce these policies and what does that look like. And so today, what we want to talk about, and we don't have time to really do this justice, because really when it comes to policy implementation and compliance, we could have entire days on these topics and lessons learned. But we really want to talk about in this session is having a new lens and a new framework on how we have conversations around making these policies work. And so I'll be doing a brief introduction and then turning it over to Julie, who we're so excited to have to talk about just the holistic aspect of equitable enforcement and tobacco control, and really focusing in on these policies on college campuses as well as off of college campuses, really as public health policies. And so when it comes to our work on college and university campuses, one thing that we really need to focus on is what is the goal of these policies. And this is something, if you were in the session last week, you heard us talk about, but I really want to reiterate this because this is really critical. So when we look at the goals of our smoke and tobacco-free policies, one of the first things is to prevent initiation. And so we know specifically with young adults, we know that young people may experiment with tobacco before the age of 18. That's obviously starting to change where more young people are getting addicted before the age of 18 because of the highly potent and addictive nicotine products that are on the market right now. And we've seen an increase in youth vaping, which has a huge impact. But we know that a lot of young people really cement their addiction and are still experimenting with these products during their young adult years. We also know that college years are really a critical time and influential when it comes to nicotine use. And also we're seeing a lot with marijuana use. We know that the college population has seen the highest increase in marijuana vaping in the last couple of years of any population. And so this is a time where it's critical that we have an opportunity to prevent young people from initiating or continuing their tobacco use behavior. We also know that these policies support people in quitting tobacco. So college campuses, you all are familiar with them. You either work on one, you go to one, or you're supporting a college or university campus. And many of them are massive. They're large, and some of them are larger than cities and towns that we have in our state. And so we know that campuses are made up of students. They're also made up of staff who work there 40+ hours a week, and they're made up of faculty, contractors, visitors. And so these policies, these outdoor air policies, do a lot to really support people who are either living on campus, working on campus, or learning on campus in quitting tobacco. So individuals who are addicted, we know that a large percent of people who are addicted to tobacco really want to quit. And so these policies can support them in quitting. And we also know that individuals who have quit and who work in a tobacco-free environment are more successful in staying quit. And we also are really big advocates for supporting students in being successful when they're on campus and when they graduate. And so supporting students in living tobacco-free, we know that students who do use tobacco have a harder time with academics. There's some research on that, especially from K through 12 students. And then we know also that when students graduate from a college campus, or if they are transferring from a community college and they're going to a four-year institution, they are going into smoke and tobacco-free spaces. So right now in California, our public colleges or public universities, CSU and UCs, are completely smoke and tobacco-free. And so if we have students that are transferring from community colleges, they're now going into smoke-free spaces. And we also know that many employers in our state are smoke and tobacco-free. Medical campuses, K through 12 campuses, and other employers. And so if we can support students in quitting before they transition into these spaces, we're helping them be more successful. And then finally, our goals with these policy are really to decrease exposure to tobacco. And so I only put on here exposure to secondhand smoke, the third-hand smoke, and also tobacco waste. But the comprehensive policies that we have also decrease exposure to tobacco marketing and the advertising. And so I briefly mentioned last week about how the industry has really tried to utilize partnerships to do industry sponsorship, tobacco sales. We even were dealing with probably a year ago, we were dealing with Juul wanting to place vending machines in fraternity households in LA County. So the industry really knows that they have a market with the college community, and they're trying to do a lot to get their products out there. And so the more we can decrease the exposure to the marketing, to the secondhand smoke, and also to the waste that exists on campus, the better off we are. And so really when we look at this, the goal of our policies and the advocacy work we do for these policies is to change the norm around tobacco use. It's not to hurt or to criminalize tobacco users. I intentionally started with our goals being to prevent initiation and to support quit attempts. Because as Linda mentioned in the very first session, we love our tobacco users. We are doing this work for the purposes of public health and to support people in living tobacco free. So our enemy in this work really is the tobacco industry. It is not tobacco users. And so we really have to consider that when we're looking at how we do enforcement, because we're not wanting to hurt individuals for their tobacco use. We're wanting to support people in quitting. And so how do we do this? The first step is to really start with strong implementation. So this is something where we talk to a lot of campuses and say the adoption part feels really hard. And I understand that feels hard, especially with governance. I love the governance that we have on our colleges here in California. Shared governance is really critical to successful campuses, but it can take time, and that often feels like it's the hardest part of the work. But we also know that the longer part of the work is the implementation and the compliance and making sure that these policies work and they achieve the goals that we have laid out, that they support people in quitting and that they support preventing initiation and removing tobacco waste from our environment, and not just tobacco litter, but getting rid of the waste of all of these different tobacco and nicotine products from entering our environment. And so we do this by starting with strong implementation, because many people don't know what a smoke and tobacco free policy is on their campus. And if you don't know it, you may not comply with it. And this is something I always joke with people about, but I don't know about all of you, but when you went to college, if you went to college, I highly doubt that the first thing you did was look up the smoke and tobacco free policy on your college campus. I had no idea of it when I was in school. Most people don't know. And even sometimes when we call colleges, they don't know themselves what the policy is, because it's not often a priority for the campuses. And so what we have an opportunity to do is to really put together strong implementation plans and to work with campuses to integrate the policy into the culture of the campus and into the different aspects of the campus so that people are aware of the policy and they have an opportunity to comply with it. And today we have some really awesome presentations on this from some of our campus partners who have been doing this work for a number of years. The other thing that's really critical is we need to discuss what is successful compliance. When do we know that we don't need to have conversations around compliance or enforcement anymore on our campus? And so into the weeds where we say, we saw a tobacco user and that's a problem. But if we know that the policy, if we've done great implementation, we've done a lot of education, a lot of people are quitting, and we're not seeing that many people on campus using the product anymore, is that when we reach success? So it's really critical that campuses have this discussion in place so that you can say, okay, when we are doing observations and we only see a certain number of people on campus, or when we decrease our tobacco waste to this level, then we know that we've reached success and we can back off from our compliance interventions. The key to this is data. So it's really critical to collect data to see what the burden of tobacco is on your campus so you can measure that success. And then you can really look at targeting your compliance interventions to those areas. And again, you'll hear some really innovative ways that campuses are trying to do this. We have a whole talk later in the day about tracking, using new technology to track the impact of tobacco on campus, and then you can measure that success and then figure out where to really focus on that education. And then also, we have to consider the impact of compliance or enforcement efforts on the campus. So again, if our goal is to support people in quitting, if what we're wanting to do is to prevent people from starting and support people in quitting, we have to look at, are our compliance strategies doing that? Or are we burdening communities otherwise by some of our efforts? And so the big focus, again, I mentioned earlier, these are public health policies with the goal of supporting people and living tobacco free. And so how are our interventions doing that? What are we doing to support people in quitting tobacco? And so with all of this, we have a lot of tools. And that's the exciting thing. We've learned so much from our partners at the University of California and the California State University system, and also many of our partners from community colleges who have been smoking tobacco free for years. And we've learned from them what some successful compliance interventions are. And so you'll hear today about different educational and non-punitive ways of doing education, doing enforcement. We do have tools in California that can be utilized to write citations, issue fines. And if anyone is happy and learning about those, I'm happy to share with you offline. There's a long history of this. It's very technical, and we can share the experiences of campuses and what that looks like. But really what we are focusing on and what we encourage campuses to focus on is the educational side. And really, again, just doing extensive education to support students and staff in quitting tobacco. And so again, the goal is to shift from enforcement, talk more about compliance and how we make this a public health intervention and supporting people in quitting tobacco. And with that, I will turn it over to Julie.
Thanks, Kim. Let me share my screen here, one sec. Okay, so some of what I'm going to be talking about here would probably reiterate some of what Kim already mentioned. So how do we go about centering equity in the enforcement of smoke or tobacco-free campus policies and other tobacco control policies generally? So I'm Julie, I'm Marjorie. I'm a staff attorney with the Public Health Law Center. Just to give you a sense of who we are. So we are the law and partnership policy to end the commercial tobacco epidemic. The Law and Policy Partnership is a joint initiative of the American Lung Association and the Public Health Law Center to support tobacco control professionals in their work to end the commercial tobacco epidemic in California. So the partnership provides free technical assistance, research, training, and analysis to help communities pass strong local tobacco ordinances that are both effective and legally sound. So I'm with the Public Health Law Center, and just to give you more background on the center, for those of you who may be unfamiliar with us, the center is located in St. Paul, Minnesota, on land that was traditionally the homelands of the Dakota people. We collaborate with others to eliminate commercial tobacco, promote healthy food, support physical activity, and address other causes of chronic disease. Our partnerships include tribal health leaders, federal agencies, state and local governments, national and regional public health advocacy organizations, community coalitions, and others who are working to advance public health policies. So we provide many types of legal technical assistance. Part of what we mean by legal technical assistance is we do legal research, we help with policy development, implementation and defense. We develop many publications which we post on our website. We also offer trainings and webinars on issues like this one, like on equitable enforcement, for instance. But we don't do direct representation of clients, and we don't lobby. So at the core of our work at the center is a concern and a commitment to equity and health equity for all people. And part of what this means is a concern for how policies impact the social determinants of health. We partner with communities and organizations to use the power of law in a way that addresses the social determinants of health and meets the specific needs of all communities, especially those who unfairly bear a greater burden of health inequities and other societal harms. Everyone deserves to be healthy. So health equity means that everyone has access to the resources they need to improve their own health. And this requires moving beyond a one-size-fits-all approach, as well as overcoming and removing the barriers that infringe on fairness, human rights, and environmental justice. So this concern for health equity is actually at the heart of our presentation today on equitable enforcement. So today's takeaways and some of the points I'm going to touch on is the broad question is, well, what is equitable enforcement? So in doing equitable enforcement, part of what we want to think about is what is the context? Who are the impacted persons? So who is impacted by this policy? What is the situation, the environment? What is the historical context? And we also, in light of this context, we also want to consider what are the potential downsides of various enforcement mechanisms, including the traditional tools, mechanisms of criminalization and fines. Finally, we want to think about, are there non-punitive alternative measures that might be just as, perhaps even more effective in achieving compliance with policies? So what is equitable enforcement? So equitable enforcement is a process of ensuring compliance with law and policy that considers and minimizes harms to underserved populations. So let's break that down. Enforcement generally is about, so the whole rationale behind any enforcement at all is, so you have a policy on the books, and the question is, how do you obtain compliance with the policy so that the policy actually does what it's supposed to do, actually achieves the result you intend by having the policy. So it's a way of incentivizing compliance. So equitable enforcement specifically means considering factors, pursuing compliance while also paying attention to the overall goal of any public health policy. And I think Kim already touched on some of this. So you want to keep in mind the overall goal, which is health equity, so that the enforcement mechanisms we adopt don't create new inequities or even exacerbate the existing disparities. So for example, you have two individuals who receive a $200 citation for a traffic violation. One of them is wealthy and the other one is making minimum wage and may even have dependents. So it's the same offense, they have the same offense, but the person making minimum wage is actually bearing a greater punishment for the offense, because $200 for the wealthy places absolutely no burden, but the same is certainly not true for the person only making minimum wage. So this is part of what we're thinking about when we are thinking equitable enforcement. So keeping in mind the overall goal. So we want to make sure that equity is front and center at every stage of policy, from the determination on what policy is needed to implementation, to enforcement and evaluation. So, and we know that, health inequities are the result of avoidable, inequitable social, economic, and environmental conditions that result in disparate health and life outcomes. So we should pay attention to equity generally and inequity in enforcement if we care to address public health. And part of the reason for this is that laws and policies play a huge role in shaping the social, economic, and environmental conditions. So laws and policies can have a positive role in actually improving and advancing these conditions, or they can actually undermine them. So this leads us to think about, to consider the social determinants of health. So when we talk about the social determinants of health, we are thinking about those factors or conditions that the human beings and human communities need to thrive. So things like stable employment, stable housing, and safe roads, transportation, safe neighborhoods. We're thinking about safe and supportive schools, nutritious food, a social context that is supportive, support system, social integration, community engagement, good health care. So all of these factors, what we call social determinants of health, actually impact health, and laws and policies can actually go a long way to improving them or undermining them. So that's part of why equity should be front and center at every stage of policy development. So thinking about the context, one of the issues is who gets targeted. So we know that the tobacco industry has historically targeted particular groups, including youth, young people, young women, indigenous people, LGBTQ, low socioeconomic youth, including Blacks and people of color, for instance, with menthol targeting. We also know that we tend to find more tobacco retailers in lower income neighborhoods. So in those neighborhoods, you tend to have higher tobacco retailer density. We also know that cigarettes are often cheaper and there's often more price discounting offered. Studies also indicate that there is more menthol advertising near high schools with more Black students. In California, for example, for every 10% increase in the proportion of Black students, there's a 6% increase in menthol advertising, and the odds of a Newport promotion was 50% higher, and the cost of Newport was 12 cents lower. So we have certain populations being disproportionately targeted with these products. It's no surprise then that we also find disproportionate use. So this graph shows 2019 California commercial tobacco use data. The red vertical bar, represents the state average on tobacco use, which is around 11%. So, so you can see that some groups significantly are higher than the state average. So LGBTQ use is at 17.4%, Black or African American is at 17%, and American Indian is about 19.1%. And among those who own a house, the use rate is at 9.7% versus 13.1% for those who live in multi-unit housing. So who is getting exposed to tobacco? So we know that African American children and adults are more likely to be exposed to secondhand smoke than any other racial or ethnic group. And in multi-unit housing in California, you have 63% of residents of multi-unit housing in California are people of color. In a 2019 to 2020 LA County survey of multi-unit housing residents, 39% reported secondhand smoke exposure from tobacco, 36% from marijuana, and 9% from e-cigarettes. So this graph represents the various substances people get addicted to and the rate of addiction. So the dark gray bar represents the general population who have ever used the substance, while the red bar represents the general population who ever became addicted. So as we can see, tobacco is number one at 24% in terms of addictiveness compared to other substances, even including heroin and cocaine. And even though alcohol is number one in terms of the population who have ever used, is almost half that of tobacco in terms of addictiveness. So clearly tobacco is perhaps the most addictive substance. So this fact of addiction, including the reality of targeting and everything else we've talked about, should have implications for how we structure policies, particularly enforcement. So tobacco addiction and punishment. So research supports a shift toward decriminalization of addiction. According to the World Health Organization, there is very little relationship between the severity of sanctions prescribed for drug use and the prevalence or frequency of use. In fact, psychologists, studies believe that punitive measures are not effective, generally speaking, for behavior change. And this is especially true where the behavior in question is addictive. So in general, it's best to avoid punitive measures. According to the CDC, the most effective approaches for helping youth quit tobacco are counseling and education. So criminalization and enforcement. One important rationale for avoiding punitive measures, such as criminal prosecution, is that we tend to find racial disparities at every level of the justice system. So we find racial disparities in policing, in arrests, in charging, plea bargaining, sentencing, and time spent in prison. I would highlight a few examples here, but I don't think we have that much time, so I'm gonna move on. So generally speaking, in other areas, other areas of, tobacco control, even though a particular focus here is campus policies, other areas of tobacco control can also inform what we do in the smoke-free campus policy context. So for instance, in the tobacco retail context, we want to avoid POP penalties called, known as purchase, use, and possession penalties. They can be discriminatory in enforcement. We tend to find more Blacks and Hispanic youth, citations for more Black and Hispanic youths, even accounting for smoking frequency. And because these are young people, and who, of course, they are low income, if any income, so fines can be very burdensome and difficult to afford. So, one lesson, an enforcement lesson, can be taken from the case of New York City. I have a video that I played, but looking at the time, I think I'm going to skip the video just in the interest of time. But part of the whole upshot of New York City is that New York City, I may not be able to skip the video. Is the video playing right now?
The reason why I had open warrants, I had a traffic violation in 1997, a ticket that was never taken care of, that I was unaware of. And
okay, I'm not sure it's going to let me skip the video. Okay, may have to play the video.
The reason why I had open warrants, I had a traffic violation in 1997, a ticket that was never taken care of, that I was unaware of. And then I had an open warrant from 2006 for open container, in which I had a beer in Central Park. I was unaware of these open warrants, and I got pulled over for a traffic violation, and when they ran my name, they came back to tell me that I had 2 warrants for my arrest.
My focus altogether in the suggestions I'm making is to reduce the necessity for a person to come to court and understand.
Kim, is the video playing?
We can hear the video, but we can't see it. I think it's on the.
Okay.
Yeah. I have the title of the video, but the title slide is where the video should be.
And it's not letting me skip over it.
And that most people who get these citations are folks who do not have big incomes.
Julie, maybe stop sharing your screen and then try to reshare and start off afterwards.
Okay.
Issue is how it's a waste of resources. Like how much money was spent feeding me, transport me, everything that they.
Okay. So the video, let me see here. So I'm going to, so the offshot of that video, sorry I couldn't play that. So it highlighted some of the issues with New York City's prior enforcement structure. So the city passed, in light of some of the issues the video highlighted, and where essentially where you have compounding consequences, where a ticket for a traffic violation or an open container or public urination actually results in incarceration. So the city passed the Criminal Justice Reform Act in 2016. And so that the offenses in this graph, like open container, public urination, in park after hours, now became civil offenses with no risk of creating a criminal record or no summons or possibility of arrest. So another context where we can sort of draw some lessons is the school enforcement context. And in this context, we want to avoid, penalties like expulsion and suspension, and actually focus on measures that help youth succeed and address the underlying problem. So best practices suggest employing alternative measures like counseling, education, and graduated penalties for repeat offenses. So just some points about the traditional enforcement measures and their potential downsides. So criminalization can exacerbate inequity.
Hey everyone, we might have lost her internet connection. So we will give her a minute to hopefully hop back on. In the meantime, if you have any questions that you have been thinking about before we lost Julie, feel free to put them in the chat box, and then we're just going to give her a minute to hop.
Can you see me, Kim?
Oh, yes.
Okay, I'm going to share screen again. Sorry about that. So, so I was saying, so criminalization can trigger unnecessary interactions with law enforcement. And in the case of fines, fines can place a huge burden on low-income persons. And it can also lead to compounding consequences, where a failure to pay a fine leads to some jail term. So, so consider alternative compliance measures. Using alternative enforcement approaches for public health policies has the potential not only to address the inequities that can arise from traditional enforcement, like fines and incarceration, but also to improve compliance among individuals and businesses. So in the context of campus policies, smoke-free and tobacco-free policies, all of what we've talked about in the context comes into play. You're dealing in this context mostly with young people, youth and young adults. So you have to consider, the burden that even penalties like fines can place on them. And you're also dealing with, the same groups of people, that have been historically underserved, that have been targeted by the tobacco industry that might also be addicted to some of, to these substances. So education is a critical piece, can be a critical piece for actually achieving compliance. So educate and obtain buy-in even before the rollout of the policy, build awareness through signage and every other possible means, spread the word, employ student ambassadors if possible, use online resources, for instance, with maps of smoke-free areas, and promote cessation resources. So, education and outreach can significantly improve compliance, change norms, and benefit, the community as well as promote buy-in for the policy. And one thing to consider here is that, and I think Kim already mentioned this, violations may occur not out of willfulness, but due to insufficient awareness or understanding of the policy. So education is a really critical component. So one example that I have here is an Indiana University study. So this was a study on the effect of a smoke-free campus policy on college students' smoking behaviors and attitudes. And what this study found was that even with lax enforcement, they found significant changes within a 2-year period in student smoking rates, in the social norms and attitudes around smoking, and in attitudes towards smoking regulations. According to one of the study's author, the positive changes observed despite lax enforcement may be attributable to increased awareness of the policy due to signage, media coverage, and I'm quoting him here, and a campus bus completely wrapped with anti-tobacco messaging. So this study sort of, makes the point or confirms the insight that education is a critical piece and spreading the word and just making the students, making the campus aware of the policy and also the rationale behind the policy. So I have some resources here that might sort of offer more on this topic. So the Public Health Law Center has a resource, Student Commercial Tobacco Use in Schools, Alternative Measures. And there's also a very good resource from Change Labs on equitable enforcement for achieving health equity. So this is our contact information. Feel free to contact the center or contact me directly with any questions. So Kim, I turn it over back to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Julie. So we did want to spend some time for discussion and any questions that anybody has. This is, like I mentioned, this is usually one of the top questions that we get from our team is, what do we do around enforcement? What do we do with compliance? So I'll give everyone a minute to just post any questions you have in the chat, or if you like, you can also unmute yourself and share your questions.
I was going to ask a question. I've heard of secondhand smoke. What is third-hand smoke? Where does that come from?
Yeah, great question, Teresa. So the third-hand smoke is the smoke that sticks to walls, to clothing, to skin. So anytime that somebody is using a combustible product, or even we know that there's third-hand aerosol from vaping products. That's all the molecules that are sticking to things. So, for example, if you buy a car that somebody else previously owned and you get in and it smells like smoke, that's the third-hand smoke. So it's not active smoke, but it's the residue that's left behind. So there's some new science that's come out. Well, it's not really new anymore, but there's science that's come out that showed that the third-hand smoke, so all of those molecules that are sticking to different things, are still letting out the toxins that were in the secondhand smoke.
That's like having cigarette butts on the campus and they're staying there. Would that be like third-hand smoke?
So the third-hand smoke we find more on tobacco users who it's maybe on their clothing, on their skin, on walls. Yeah, the tobacco waste, and that's a really important issue. So researchers from San Diego State University, Dr. Novotny and his team have done a lot of research on tobacco waste specifically, and have found that those cigarette butts that are left on campus or left elsewhere never go away. And in addition to not going away, they also are leaching out the chemicals that are in the cigarette, and they leach out into the environment. So that's a big issue. Something to note as well with tobacco waste specifically is, one, from an environmental perspective, this is very much, the more we get people to not use the products, the less waste we have in the environment. So regardless if it's littered or disposed of properly, it's still waste that just never goes away. And so the best way to prevent these products from going into the environment is to just support people in quitting and never start using them, and then we won't have them to dispose of.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Are there any other questions that anyone has thought of for Julie, or any questions on compliance or enforcement? You all are a quiet group today. So I can just share for anyone, I had kind of alluded this in my talk, but didn't get too far into it. In California, we do have legislation that was passed many years back to allow colleges and universities, specifically public colleges and universities, the opportunity to issue citations. It's part of a government code that allows campuses to enforce their own smoke and tobacco-free policies. There's some nuanced pieces to it that require the officers who use this citations, they have to be sworn police officers. And some campuses have experimented with using fines and citations, and there's a lot of issues with doing so, all the way from just not having support from administration to utilize citations. Really trying to look at, do we want enforcement entities to be the ones to be the faces of smoke and tobacco free policies, when again, we really want to focus on supporting people and quitting. Really how today's session has been designed is to hear from groups who are doing alternate ways of doing education through ambassador programs or through really robust implementation programs, or integrating the policy throughout the campus community. There are also people who have done amazing work partnering with campus police or with security, but in a different way than saying, we've passed this policy, now it's your job to go enforce, and really doing it in an educational perspective. And so I think, I got so much from Julie's talk, and one of the pieces that is really critical to hear is that we see that policing looks very different based on race and ethnicity. And so we need to really be cognizant of that and looking at who we're impacting the policies. And then also, I think it's critical to note as well that when we look at who's using tobacco in California, and we know that we still have a number of disparities in who's using tobacco, that we have to really make sure that we're doing a lot to support quit attempts, and ensuring that people also have access to tobacco treatment, which can be a challenge for some campuses that don't have the resources to have tobacco treatment services. So this is a really overwhelming experience, but our hope is that through the rest of the session, that you can learn that there are some really incredible ways of doing education and doing compliance work that looks very different than turning this over to law enforcement to write citations. So there's
Sorry, I
a
have
campus.
a question.
Oh, sure. Go ahead, Ignacio.
Sorry, Kim. It took me a little bit to think through this, but I did have a question for Julie. Kind of okay, so when we're talking about making sure that there are not inequities, and we're dealing with multiple cultural groups, what are some best practices or processes to where we can make sure that, or I guess, how are we measuring and keeping that in balance to reduce as much as possible the negative impacts when we're creating these policies, or trying to find ways to kind of find solutions?
I think one of the starting points, I think, is making sure that in the policy development, even at the policy development stage, where you're even thinking about the policy, you're engaging the community, and making sure that all the groups that will be impacted by the policies, the underserved populations, and all the groups sort of have a voice. You bring them to the table, you make sure that they are aware of the policy. So getting engaged, community engagement and buy-in from the beginning is critical, because that's part of how you come to actually learn, what inequities there are, or what the impacts might be. So the more representative the group is in the thinking around the policy, the fairer, another way to put it, the fairer the process around policy development, where the cross section of the community is included, then the more likely we are to have a policy that works well for everyone and that is equitable. So at every level, at every stage of the process and all the processes, we are thinking equity and fairness. And what that means critically is engaging, having a variety of voices, because the more voices you have, then the fairer the process, the likely the fairer the outcome. Does that answer your question somewhat, Ignacio?
Yes, I appreciate it.
We also have another question. What are campuses doing when they find people violating the policy? What's been effective? And are people asked to see a counselor, nurse, and who is doing the education at the point? That is a fantastic question, Emily. So it looks different depending on the campuses and the capacity of the campus to do educational programs. So some of the really effective outreach that campuses are doing are ambassador programs. So this is engaging students, faculty, staff, administrators to serve as ambassadors who go out and do education on the campus. If they see somebody who is using tobacco, simply going up and saying, hey, did you know that we're a smoking tobacco free campus? And then they hand cards that have information about the policy on one side, and then on the other side have information about quitting. Some campus partners in the past have done really great work with those cards. For example, De Anza College, on their cards, they have policy reminder cards, and on the back of the cards, there's also quit tips to help people know, like, hey, if you want to quit, here are some things that you can do, or if you just need to manage your addiction during the day when you're on campus, here are some alternatives that you can use, that like drinking water, going for a walk, doing these different things while you're on campus and you can't use tobacco products. San Francisco State University has a phenomenal training that we've worked with them on, and we've incorporated it into our ambassador trainings on how to kind of pre-assess where people are at before ambassadors interact with them. And so it's like a scale of openness. And so if you start to approach somebody and you're getting a pretty bad, like, hey, they're not going to talk to us, or this isn't going to go very well, then that's at a point where you disengage from that conversation. We've had partners at CSU Long Beach who have told us that they have an awesome ambassador program, and their students get to know the tobacco users on campus, and they have friendly relationships. And that has really opened up for these students to regularly just do some like motivational interviewing and encourage them to quit. So that's really a big focus right now, is to refer them either to student health or refer them to off-campus resources, and just reminding people of the policy. And then there are other strategies if it gets to a point where somebody is purposely violating the policy and is combative about it. Then there's ways of going through like human resources, going through student affairs. And so you'll hear some of that in the talks today. We have in our first breakout session, which we'll break for in 1 minute, but we have our partners from CSU Northridge, and then Julie, who is now at the University of Southern California, but previously with UC, who can talk about those different aspects from a student perspective and a staff perspective of how to deal with people who might not want to follow the policy, kind of repeat policy violators, and share some of those different strategies. So with that, I will just thanks so much to Julie for taking the time to be here today and for sharing this awesome presentation. And thanks everybody for coming today on Friday. I know Friday mornings are a little bit tough, but thank you for being here. And now, just as a reminder, once you log off here, you can go back in and click the link that or click on the website you used to get here, and then find the session that you're interested in listening in and click that link, and it will take you right to that session. So we look forward to seeing everybody back in this main room after the second breakout.